Ethan had been crafting coffins for over 30 years. His workshop was a humble one, tucked away on the outskirts of town, filled with the scent of sawdust and varnish. He took pride in his work, pouring his skill into every grain of wood, every polished surface. His coffins were more than just boxes for the dead. They were pieces of art, made to rest the departed with dignity. And his most loyal clients were the Baudelaire family. The Baudelaires were old money, the kind that stretched back for centuries. Their estate loomed on a hill overlooking the town, a sprawling mansion draped in ivy and guarded by wrought iron gates. The family had always been private, rarely seen outside their grand home. Yet over the years they had kept a steady business relationship with Ethan, commissioning elaborate coffins for their deceased relatives. It had started simply enough. Ethan's father had passed the trade down to him, and along with it, a promise to honor the long-standing agreement with the Baudelaires. "They've been good to our family," his father had said. "Never ask too many questions, and they'll make it worth your while." And they had. The money was always generous, sometimes double the asking price. The specifications for each order were precise: solid oak, silver nails, crimson velvet lining. It seemed odd, but the carpentry was more than enough to keep Ethan occupied, and he had never bothered to pry into the lives of his patrons. At first, it wasn't until the fifth coffin in just as many years that Ethan began to notice something was strange. There were no funerals, no wakes. The coffins were always delivered under cover of night, and the instructions were clear: leave the crate outside the gates, and the payment would be left inside an envelope by morning. Ethan was used to dealing with the odd requests of grieving families, but this was different. The Baudelaires never even gave the names of the deceased. He might have continued to brush it off as eccentricity. After all, the rich were known to have peculiar habits. But the more coffins he delivered, the more he began to notice other things. Mr. Laurent Baudelaire, the patriarch, hadn't aged a day since the first time they'd met, nearly 20 years ago. His daughter Vivienne still had the same ageless beauty, her pale skin and sharp features frozen in time like a porcelain doll. Even the family portraits that hung in the entry hall appeared unchanged with each visit, as though time simply did not touch them. One night, after delivering yet another coffin to the estate, Ethan's curiosity got the better of him. He lingered near the gate, just out of sight, waiting to catch a glimpse of someone retrieving the coffin. Hours passed, and just as he was about to leave, a figure emerged from the mansion. It was Vivienne. She moved gracefully, yet with a swiftness that seemed unnatural. She approached the crate and, with a single hand, lifted the heavy coffin as though it weighed nothing at all. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The next day he decided to do some digging, metaphorically speaking. The local archives contained records of the Baudelaire family stretching back to the 1700s, but it was the photographs that caught his attention. The faces, those same pale, perfect faces, hadn't changed in over 2 centuries. The names were reused, generation after generation, yet the people in the pictures looked exactly the same. He returned to his workshop that night unsettled. As he worked on his latest commission, a particularly intricate coffin for Miss Eliza Baudelaire, his thoughts kept drifting back to Vivienne's strange strength, to the untouched portraits. His chisel slipped, and a deep gash marred the coffin's smooth surface. Cursing under his breath, he began to sand it down, but the oddity of it all gnawed at him like termites in old wood. Finally, he couldn't resist any longer. When the coffin was finished, he decided he would deliver it personally and stay to see what happened next. That night, Ethan drove his truck to the Baudelaire mansion, the crate strapped in the back. He arrived as the moon hung high, casting pale light over the estate. He placed the coffin outside the gates as usual, but this time, instead of leaving, he hid in the shadows of the hedge nearby, peering through the wrought iron. Minutes ticked by, then an hour. Just as before, Vivienne emerged. She approached the coffin, her movements unnaturally fluid. As she bent down to lift the crate, Ethan noticed something else. Her eyes glowed faintly red in the moonlight. Suddenly, her head snapped up, and her gaze fixed directly on his hiding place. "I know you're there, Ethan," she said softly, her voice carrying a lilt that was both melodic and menacing. Ethan stepped out of the shadows, his heart pounding. What are you?" he stammered. Vivienne tilted her head, a smile curling her lips. "We are what we have always been," she replied. "And you, dear Ethan, have been crafting our beds for centuries. Did you really think it was coincidence that the Baudelaires have been loyal customers for so long?" His blood ran cold. "You're vampires." Vivienne's smile widened, revealing a pair of sharp, glistening fangs. "Yes, and you, my dear carpenter, have made it possible for us to rest during the day, safe and secure in the fine coffins you've so lovingly crafted." Ethan felt a wave of nausea. You use them over and over? Not exactly, Vivian said, her tone turning darker. Every once in a while, we do require a new arrangement. But rest assured, you've done excellent work. Your craftsmanship will live on, even if you do not. Before Ethan could react, Vivian was in front of him, moving with a speed that defied belief. Her hand shot out, seizing his wrist with a grip like iron. You could join us, she whispered. Become immortal. Or, the offer hung in the air, a terrible temptation. Ethan looked at the coffin he had made, its polished wood gleaming under the moonlight. He thought of the generations of Baudelaire's, forever young, their faces unmarked by time, and he thought of the fate that awaited him if he refused. The next morning, a new envelope sat on Ethan's workshop bench. It was stuffed with crisp bills, and a note written in elegant script read, "Thank you for your continued service." The townsfolk noticed that Ethan's shop seemed to be open less often after that. When he was seen, he looked healthier, stronger, his skin almost unnaturally pale, yet his ageless eyes carried a look that spoke of something ancient and knowing. The coffins he continued to craft were just as beautiful as ever, though some who bought them remarked on a curious thing. They seemed almost too comfortable, as though they weren't meant to stay closed forever.
When Eternus hit the market, the world seemed to collectively hold its breath. Here was a drug that promised the impossible. It would stop aging in its tracks. For the price of a single injection, you could be frozen at your current age, eternally youthful, immune to the ravages of time. People lined up in droves, desperate to escape wrinkles, arthritis, and death itself. The promise of immortality was too tantalizing to resist. But I did. It wasn't that I didn't want to stay young. I just had a deep mistrust of new medicine, especially one that seemed too good to be true. My father had died from a botched surgery when I was a teenager, and the fear of putting something foreign into my body had never really left me. So when my friends eagerly received their injections, I stayed behind, watching as the world began to shift around me. At first it was subtle. The difference between myself and everyone else wasn't that noticeable. I was in my late 30s then, and so were my friends. We still looked young. We still acted young. We laughed about the prospect of being forever 30-somethings while out at bars or on trips. The people who had taken the injection seemed to glow with a kind of vibrant confidence that I didn't possess, as though they could feel their own immortality coursing through their veins. But as the years went by, the gap between me and the eternally young began to widen. While I spotted the first few strands of gray in my hair and noticed faint lines etching themselves around my eyes, my friends remained unchanged. They were frozen in time, while I continued to march forward. 10 years in, it started to feel lonely. The people around me didn't share the same concerns. They didn't understand why I joked about being over the hill or complained about the aches in my joints. To them, such things were from another world, a world they had escaped. Then around the 15-year mark, something changed. It started as whispers, unsettling rumors spreading quietly among those who had taken Eternus. People began experiencing short-term memory loss, sudden outbursts of aggression, and even strange hallucinations. A friend of mine, Kate, who had been one of the earliest to get the injection, confided in me during a lunch. She told me that sometimes she would find herself in a room and not remember how she'd gotten there. More than once, she had woken up with no memory of the previous day. I suggested she see a doctor, but she just laughed it off. "It's nothing," she said, waving away my concerns. "I'm probably just stressed." But it wasn't nothing. The incidents became more frequent, and as the 20th year since Eternus's release approached, reports began surfacing of people going missing, simply vanishing without a trace. Kate was one of them. She had gone out for groceries one evening and never returned. Her husband told me she hadn't taken any of her belongings, and there was no evidence of foul play. She was just gone. I started noticing more signs of deterioration in others. The eternally young would stare blankly in the middle of conversations, as though they'd forgotten what they were talking about. A few of my friends became noticeably paranoid, accusing people of things that never happened, or claiming that someone was after them. The glow of vitality that had once set them apart from me began to fade, replaced by a subtle pallor that seemed to deepen with each passing day. Then came the official announcement. Researchers had discovered that Eternus had a dark secret. While it did indeed halt the aging process, it also prevented cellular regeneration. The body's natural ability to repair itself was gone. It was as though time itself had been frozen, not just the outward signs of aging. For 20 years, their bodies had endured wear and tear without recovery, and now the effects were manifesting in terrible ways. Neurological decay, organ failure, and even psychosis were reported as the body's slow accumulation of unhealed damage came to light. The side effects were irreversible. As the news spread, panic gripped the public. The company that had developed Eternus went silent, and lawsuits piled up by the thousands. But no amount of litigation could change the fact that people had willingly traded their futures for an illusion of eternal youth. And now their bodies were beginning to fall apart, crumbling under the weight of 2 decades worth of unseen damage. I watched from the sidelines, haunted by what I saw. The eternally young, once vibrant and fearless, were now trapped in bodies that refused to heal, unable to age but still succumbing to the silent decay they could not see. Those who had taken the injection seemed to lose themselves more each day, forgetting names, faces, places. It was as though they were fading from existence, one memory at a time. One night I had a dream about Kate. In it, she was sitting across from me at a familiar cafe, her face untouched by age but her eyes vacant, hollow. She kept repeating, "I don't know where I am," over and over. When I reached out to touch her hand, she crumbled into ash, scattering in the wind. I woke up with a start, my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that Kate and the others weren't just missing. They were being undone. Like some part of them was unraveling, leaving behind only an empty shell that slowly dissolved into nothingness. As I looked at myself in the mirror that morning, I noticed the wrinkles around my eyes, the gray hairs at my temples. I saw the signs of time's passage etched into my skin, but I also saw something else, something that the eternally young had lost. Life. Real, flawed, ever-changing life. For the first time in years, I felt grateful. Grateful that I had chosen to age, to change, to live each moment for what it was. The gray in my hair and the lines on my face were proof that I still had time left to grow and heal, to feel the aches and joys of being truly alive. And as the world continued to unravel around Eternus, I found myself thankful that I had let time take its course. I chose to keep aging, and now I was the one who had survived.
Do you know who usually wins a magic duel when it turns into a fistfight? The old mage had once told me, leaning back in his chair, his eyes twinkling with the memory of past battles. The one who first realizes that the duel has turned into a fistfight. I hadn't quite understood the lesson then, but now, as I stood on the cracked cobblestones of an old street, smoke curling from the remnants of fire spells and crackling enchantments, it became all too clear. It had started as a classic duel, 2 mages locked in a contest of arcane prowess, testing the limits of our abilities. My opponent was a notorious spellcaster known as Ashblade. His reputation preceded him. He had burned down half a forest with a single incantation and conjured storms that sank ships. His magic was raw, powerful, and without finesse, but brute strength alone wouldn't be enough to defeat me, or so I thought. We met at dawn, the designated hour for a wizard's duel. The streets were empty, save for a few wary onlookers who peered from behind shuttered windows. Ashblade stood at the far end of the cobblestone street, a looming figure cloaked in smoke-gray robes, his hands crackling with the residual energy. I took my place at the other end, a few feet behind a cracked fountain, ready to use it for cover if needed. "Shall we begin?" Ashblade growled, his voice deep and rough. He didn't wait for an answer. With a flick of his wrist, a fiery serpent leapt from his fingertips, coiling through the air with lethal grace. I sidestepped, muttering a quick counterspell that caused the serpent to burst into a shower of harmless sparks. My hands moved in a blur as I summoned a gust of wind, hurling it toward him to unbalance his footing. He responded by slamming his fist into the ground, conjuring a wall of earth that absorbed the impact of my spell. The exchange continued, back and forth, spell for spell. The air hummed with magic, each cast leaving behind the scent of burnt ozone and the shimmering residue of dispelled enchantments. I could feel the fatigue setting in. My magic reserves were dwindling, and judging by Ashblade's increasingly haphazard spells, he was struggling too. Then, in a moment of desperation, he charged forward. It wasn't with a spell, but with his body, fist clenched and teeth bared. His robe flared as he closed the distance between us. The suddenness of the move caught me off guard, and I barely managed to summon a feeble shield in time. His punch shattered through the barrier, the raw force behind it knocking me to the ground. I scrambled to get up, instinctively reaching for another spell, but Ashblade was already upon me, swinging again. I ducked, barely avoiding a fist that would have broken my nose, and in that split second, something clicked in my mind. The old mage's words echoed, as if carried on the wind. The one who first realizes that the duel has turned into a fistfight. The magic duel was over. Now, it was about survival. I threw out a low kick, sweeping his legs from under him, and he crashed to the ground with a grunt. My body moved faster than my mind. All those years of martial training I'd neglected, in favor of magical study, came flooding back. I followed up with an elbow strike aimed at his ribs, but he rolled away, quick as a fox, and managed to grab a handful of dirt, flinging it at my face. As I instinctively raised a hand to block my eyes, he lunged, slamming his shoulder into my chest and sending me sprawling backward. The stone street scraped against my back as I slid across it, but I gritted my teeth and pushed myself up. Ashblade came at me again, but this time, I was ready. I ducked his punch and drove my fist into his gut. He staggered, and I stepped forward, unleashing a flurry of strikes. Forearm to his throat, knee to his ribs, an open palm strike to his temple. Each blow came with the raw force of desperation, not some carefully rehearsed technique. I wasn't just casting spells with words anymore. I was casting them with my fists. Ashblade stumbled back, dazed, and reached out a hand, conjuring a weak spark of magic in an attempt to blast me away. I slapped his hand aside and smashed my fist into his jaw. The spark fizzled out as he crumpled to the ground, breathing heavily, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. I stood over him, chest heaving, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. For a moment, I thought he might try to get up again, but he simply lay there, coughing and cursing under his breath. The fight was over. "Remember," I gasped, rubbing my bruised knuckles, "magic is only as strong as the one who wields it. When the spells run out, all you got left is your wits and your fists." Ashblade gave a dry, bitter laugh, wiping blood from his lips. "You caught on fast," he muttered. "But next time, I won't be so quick to let it come to that." "There won't be a next time," I said, turning my back on him. "Not if you know what's good for you." As I walked away, the old mage's lesson settled in for good. The winner of a magic duel wasn't always the one with the strongest spells or the deepest reserves. It was the one who knew when to let the magic go and get their hands dirty. And now I understood why. From then on, I carried a reminder, a brass knuckle enchanted with a single, powerful rune etched on its surface. I kept it tucked in my robe, just in case another duel took a turn for the primal. Magic could be fickle, but a fist fight was straightforward. Win or lose, it came down to who was willing to throw the first punch.